I was driving through the back roads of northern Michigan when I passed by the old cabin where my ex-wife used to live. It had been years since I'd seen it, years since I had any reason to come this way. The last time I'd been here, it was still hers. Now, I didn't know who owned it, and I didn't care to find out. The road was slick from a recent rain, the sky still heavy with low, gray clouds. The trees on either side leaned over the narrow stretch of pavement, their bare branches reaching out like fingers. It was late fall, the kind of season where the cold settles into your bones, but there's not yet any snow to make it worthwhile. I didn't slow down as I passed the cabin, but my eyes flicked toward it. The place looked different. The windows were dark, the porch sagging a little more than I remembered. The gravel driveway was empty, felt abandoned. I kept driving, but a few miles down the road, something gnawed at me. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was something else. I told myself it was nothing, but my hands tightened on the wheel. I hadn't thought about that cabin in a long time. I hadn't thought about her in a long time. I pulled onto the shoulder, the tires crunching against the gravel, and stared at the road ahead. The woods pressed in on either side, dark and quiet. There was no reason to go back, no reason to check, but I did. I turned the truck around, the headlights sweeping over the trees, and headed back toward the cabin. I didn't know what I was expecting to find. Maybe I just wanted to see it one last time. Maybe I wanted to know if there was anything left of the life we had there. When I pulled into the driveway, I cut the engine and sat there for a while, listening to the ticking of the cooling motor. The place was silent. The wind had died down, and the only sound was the distant call of some bird in the trees. I stepped out of the truck, my boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, and walked toward the porch. The wood groaned under my weight as I climbed the steps. The door was closed, the lock rusted. I ran my fingers over the frame, feeling the chipped paint. The window to the left of the door had been broken. The glass was gone, leaving only jagged edges. I peered inside, but the cabin was dark, empty. I should have left then. I should have turned around, gotten back in my truck, and driven away. But something didn't sit right with me. I stepped off the porch and walked around the side of the cabin. The backyard had been overgrown with weeds. The fire pit we used to sit around now just a ring of scattered stones. That's when I saw the footprints. They were fresh, not old enough to be washed away by the rain. They led from the woods to the back door of the cabin. I felt a tightness in my chest. Someone had been here. Maybe they were still here. I moved slowly, listening to the silence around me. I had no reason to go inside, but I found myself testing the back door anyway. Creaked open. The air inside was stale, the smell of damp wood and rot thick in my nose. The cabin had been cleared out, nothing left but dust and forgotten corners. The floorboards creaked under my boots as I stepped inside. I walked through the kitchen, running my hand over the counter. It felt like stepping into a memory I had tried to forget. Then I heard it, a noise from the back room. It was faint, just the softest scrape of something shifting. I stood still, heart pounding. I wasn't alone. I turned, moving back toward the door. But before I could step outside, I saw something in the hallway. A single boot print, damp from the rain. I wasn't the only one who had come back. I didn't wait. I stepped out onto the porch and made my way to the truck, moving faster than I meant to. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw a flicker of movement in the rearview mirror. Someone was standing in the window of the cabin, watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just drove, and I never came that way again. I hadn't been back to my grandfather's farm in over 20 years. I inherited it after he passed, but life kept me away. I told myself I was too busy, too much work, too much going on. The truth was, I never liked being there. The old house, the empty fields, the woods stretching far beyond the property line. It made me uneasy even as a kid. But after losing my job and with no real reason to stay in the city, I packed up what little I had left and drove back to the farm. The land was just as I remembered. Flat fields that stretched for miles, a dirt driveway that was mostly overgrown, and the house, standing in the middle of it all, just as lifeless as the last time I saw it. The cabin sat further back, near the woods. That was the place I really never liked. My grandfather never let me inside. He used to tell me it was just an old storage building, nothing important, but I remember how he always kept the door locked. Even when I asked to see inside, he just shook his head. I never questioned it much as a kid. Now, standing there, looking at the weathered wood, the sagging roof, I felt that old unease crawl back under my skin. But I had work to do. The house wasn't in bad shape, just old. Dust covered everything. Mice had gotten into the walls, and the porch creaked under my weight. It was livable, though, more than I expected. I spent the first few days cleaning, fixing what I could, and trying to make the place feel like home. It never did. The nights were the worst. The farm was too quiet. I had lived in the city so long, I forgot what real silence felt like. The kind of silence where you hear every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind against the house. And then there was the sound from the cabin. It started on the second night, a dull thudding sound, like something knocking against the walls. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it kept happening. Slow, steady, like something inside was moving. I told myself it was an animal. The place had been abandoned for years. Maybe something got in through the roof. The next morning, I walked over. The cabin looked the same as before, except the lock on the door was rusted through. That didn't sit right with me. My grandfather always kept that door locked tight, but now it barely hung on. I reached out, pressed my hand against the wood. Cold. Too cold for a building sitting under the sun all morning. I didn't open the door. Instead, I went back to the house, grabbed a hammer and some nails and boarded it shut. If there was an animal inside, I didn't want it getting out. If something had been living in there, it could stay in there. That night, the noises got worse. It wasn't just knocking now. It was scratching, slow, deliberate, the sound of something dragging against wood. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every muscle in my body tense. It didn't stop. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. Not animal tracks, boots. Someone had been there, standing just outside the door. I felt sick. I told myself it had to be some drifter. Maybe someone looking for shelter, maybe just passing through. But that didn't explain the sounds. It didn't explain why the footprints only went one way, toward the cabin. Not away. That day, I drove into town, bought new locks, and reinforced the boards on the door. I even went around the back, nailed the windows shut. But the noises didn't stop. The third night, I heard the footsteps, slow, crunching in the dirt outside my window. I didn't move. I barely breathed. They stopped just outside the house, standing there for what felt like hours before moving away. I should have left. I should have packed my things and driven back to the city. But something kept me there. Maybe pride, maybe stupidity, maybe just the fact that I had nowhere else to go. On the fifth night, I heard the door open. Not the house, the cabin. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I knew I locked it. I knew I nailed it shut. But I heard the door creak, with splintering as something pushed inside. And then footsteps, not outside, inside. Something moved in that cabin. I grabbed the shotgun my grandfather kept above the fireplace, loaded it with shaking hands, and stepped outside. The night air was cold, colder than it should have been. The cabin door hung open, one of the boards I nailed up lying in the dirt. I should have run, but I didn't. I stepped inside. The air was thick, damp, filled with the scent of rot. The only light came from the moon spilling through the broken roof. The room was empty, just an old wooden table, a chair, dust covering the floor. And then I saw it, the trapdoor, a square cut into the floor, slightly raised, like someone had lifted it recently. My stomach turned. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to see what was inside, but I had to. I knelt, grabbed the edge, and pulled. The smell hit me first, the stench of decay, thick and heavy. And then, in the dim light, I saw the bones, piles of them, some animal, some not. I stumbled back, gagging, my mind trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then the sound, from the darkness below, a breath, slow, deep. I slammed the trapdoor shut and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the truck. I didn't stop driving until I saw the lights of town. I didn't go back for my things. I didn't go back for anything. I left the farm behind. I never went back. I never looked back. And I never found out what was in that cabin. I didn't want to. It was 2011 when I got the job. The work was simple, help build a cabin for a man I had never met. My boss, a guy named Tom, handled all the communication with the owner. He only told me the basics. The cabin was going up deep in the woods of northern Scotland, miles from the nearest town. The owner wanted it finished by winter. The job paid well and I needed the money. I wasn't new to construction. I had worked on houses and small commercial buildings before, but never something this remote. The land was tucked away, past logging roads that had seen better days. The truck ride out there took nearly an hour. We had to load up supplies each day, drive through thick, damp woods, and get as much done before dark as we could. There was no power, no cell service, no running water, just the woods, the cabin, and us. The work itself wasn't bad. The days were long, but I had no complaints. I liked working with my hands, and I wasn't afraid of a little isolation. The weather was the worst part. Scotland's autumn rain came down hard, soaking the ground, turning everything to mud. My boots never stayed dry, and the cold got into my bones. But I pushed through. We had a deadline to meet. It was about 2 weeks in when I started feeling like something was off. At first, it was small things. Tools weren't where I left them. Footprints in the mud that didn't match ours, the feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to paranoia. Working in the middle of nowhere will do that to you. Then, one evening, as we were packing up, I noticed something. About 30 yards from the cabin, deep in the trees, there was a pile of sticks. It wasn't natural. Someone had placed them there, stacked in a neat, deliberate way. I stared at it for a moment, but Tom called for me, and I let it go. The next morning, the pile was gone. I told myself it had to be the wind or an animal, but I knew that wasn't right. The sticks had been stacked too carefully. Someone had moved them. A week passed, and the feeling of unease grew stronger. The forest was too quiet at times, then too loud at others. At night, I lay awake in the work trailer, listening. I could hear movement outside, twigs snapping, something shifting in the darkness. One night, I stepped outside with a flashlight. The rain had let up, and the air was thick with mist. I scanned the trees, expecting to see nothing, but I did see something. A shape just at the tree line. It was tall, standing perfectly still. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark figure against the mist. I raised my light, but by the time it hit the trees, the shape was gone. I didn't tell Tom. I didn't want to sound crazy. I just focused on work and told myself it was my mind playing tricks on me. But it wasn't. One afternoon, I found deep footprints in the mud behind the cabin. They weren't ours. They were too big, too wide. They led toward the trees, then disappeared. like whoever made them had stopped walking or started walking backward, perfectly retracing their steps. That night, I heard breathing outside the trailer. Deep, slow breathing. I lay in my cot, frozen. My hand was on my hammer, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. The breathing stayed for what felt like forever, then faded into the trees. The next morning, Tom told me we were ahead of schedule. That meant we would be working later, pushing to finish before the next storm rolled in. I wanted to tell him no, to leave, to get out of there, but I needed the money, so we stayed. The last few days were the worst. I could feel it. Something was waiting. The woods felt different, heavier. The air smelled off like wet leaves and rot. On the final night, the rain returned. We packed up late, exhausted, ready to leave in the morning. I crawled into my cot, trying to ignore the wind howling outside. I woke up to a sound, a tapping, soft, rhythmic against the side of the trailer. Then it moved to the door.
Top, top, top.
I gripped my hammer and stayed still. The tapping continued for a while, then stopped. In the morning, I found footprints in the mud outside the trailer. They weren't ours. They led from the trees to the door, then back into the woods. Tom said nothing, just packed up and left without a word. I never went back. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing. We were not alone in those woods. It was the kind of rain that made you question why you took the job in the first place. Heavy, cold, and relentless, drumming against the half-built cabin like it had a personal grudge. I was soaked through before I even started, my boots squelching in the mud with every step. The wind howled through the gaps in the unfinished walls, and the trees surrounding the clearing swayed like they were whispering warnings to each other. I had agreed to take the night shift alone. My boss, a man who paid well but never seemed to care about much beyond deadlines, had thrown me an extra bit of cash to stay and keep an eye on things. The cabin was supposed to be finished within the month, and we were behind schedule. He didn't want any delays. That meant keeping the site secure overnight. I was no security guard, but I could handle myself. Or at least that's what I had told myself. The site was deep in the countryside, somewhere in the north of England, far from anything useful. It was meant to be a getaway place for my boss, his retreat from the world. But right now, it was just a skeleton of a cabin in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick forest, a muddy road leading in and out, and not a single soul around for miles. At least no one that was supposed to be there. I had a small portable light set up inside, casting long, flickering shadows against the wooden beams. The generator hummed in the corner, providing just enough power to keep my light on and charge my phone if needed. My plan was simple: sit in the driest spot, listen to the rain, and wait for my shift to be over. But as the hours passed, something started to feel off. First, it was small things: a rustling in the trees that didn't quite match the wind, a shadow that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. My tools, which I had placed on the floor near the wall, weren't exactly where I remembered leaving them. I told myself I was just tired, that the rain and darkness were playing tricks on me. Then I heard it, a sharp crack from outside, like a branch snapping underfoot. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The rain was loud, but not loud enough to cover that sound. I turned off my light, letting the darkness swallow the inside of the cabin. I listened, nothing but the storm. Then, another snap, closer this time. Someone was out there. I reached for the small flashlight on my tool belt and aimed it toward the open doorway. The beam cut through the rain, illuminating the trees just beyond the clearing. I expected to see an animal, maybe a deer or some lost hiker. Instead, I saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I considered my options. I could stay put, pretend I didn't hear anything, and wait until morning. Or I could step outside, check the perimeter, and convince myself I was imagining things. The second option felt stupid, but sitting in the dark, knowing something or someone was outside felt worse. I took a deep breath and stepped out into the rain. The mud sucked at my boots as I moved cautiously around the cabin. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in my grip, but I told myself it was just the cold. I scanned the treeline, looking for movement. The wind howled, bending the branches, making them twist and groan. I saw nothing unusual. No tracks, no figures lurking between the trees. Just rain and mud and the half-built structure behind me. I was about to turn back when I saw it. A single footprint in the mud. It was fresh, the edges still sharp, not yet washed away by the rain. And it wasn't mine. A chill ran through me. I looked around again, but whoever had left it was gone. Or hiding. The thought made my stomach turn. I hurried back inside, locking the temporary wooden door behind me. It wouldn't keep anyone out for long, but it was something. My heart was pounding as I checked my phone. No signal, no surprise there. I decided to stay awake for the rest of the night. Hours passed. The rain didn't let up. My flashlight battery was running low, so I turned it off and relied on the dim glow of the portable light. My ears were straining for any sound, but the storm covered everything. And then, just as I was beginning to think I had overreacted, I heard it again. Footsteps, not in the mud this time, inside the cabin. I felt my stomach drop. I wasn't alone. I grabbed the closest thing I could use as a weapon, an iron crowbar, and slowly turned toward the sound. My breath was shallow, my grip tight. A shadow moved in the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of my light. I swung the crowbar, hitting nothing but air. Then the light flickered and died. For a moment, the only sound was the rain hammering against the roof. Then, a whisper of movement, just inches away. I lashed out again, connecting with something solid. A grunt of pain, followed by the sound of someone stumbling back. I didn't wait. I lunged forward, swinging wildly, forcing them away from me. My eyes adjusted just enough to see a figure darting toward the open doorway. They were fast. I ran after them out into the rain, but by the time I reached the clearing, they were gone. The trees swayed, the wind roared, but whoever had been inside with me had disappeared into the night. I stood there, panting, soaked, gripping the crowbar so tightly my knuckles ached. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Another footprint, this one leading away from the cabin. But this time there were more. I wasn't dealing with just one person. I wasn't supposed to be here alone. By the time morning came, I was done. I packed my things, left the cabin, and drove away without looking back. I never told my boss what happened that night, but I knew one thing for sure. Someone or multiple someones had been watching me, and I had a feeling they weren't done. It was late October when I went up to the cabin. My dad's friend, a guy named Mark, had owned it for as long as I could remember. It sat deep in the woods, about 2 hours from the nearest town, on a stretch of land that barely anyone went through. I had been there a few times when I was younger, mostly for hunting trips with my dad, but I hadn't been back in years. Mark had called me a week earlier, saying he needed someone to check on the place. He was too busy, and my dad was out of town. He offered to pay me if I went up there for a night, checked that everything was still in one piece, and made sure no animals had gotten inside. Sounded easy enough, so I agreed. I left early in the afternoon, knowing the drive would take a while. The roads were empty, just miles of trees on either side. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. The sky was gray, and there was a light drizzle, enough to make the road slippery, but not enough to be a real problem. I had a bag packed with food, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a rifle just in case. I wasn't expecting trouble, but it felt wrong to be that deep in the woods without one. By the time I reached the turnoff to the cabin, the sun was already starting to sink behind the trees. The dirt road leading up to it was worse than I remembered. Deep ruts, overgrown branches reaching in like fingers, and mud from the rain making it harder to drive. The last few minutes of the drive were slow, the tires kicking up wet leaves and mud. The cabin sat in a small clearing, just a one-story place with a porch and a shed out back. The roof was metal, rusted in spots, and the wood siding had started to wear down. It looked abandoned, like no one had touched it in years, but it was still standing. That was good enough. I parked the truck near the porch, grabbed my bag, and stepped out. The air smelled like wet leaves and pine. The rain had stopped, but everything still dripped. It was colder than I expected. I walked up to the door and found the spare key under a loose board on the porch, exactly where Mark had said it would be. The inside of the cabin was dark and smelled like dust and old wood. I flicked on my flashlight and did a quick check. The furniture was still there. A worn-out couch, a table with a few chairs, a wood stove in the corner. A pile of firewood sat beside it, old but dry. The kitchen was just a counter, a sink, and some cabinets. There was one bedroom in the back with a small bed, a dresser, and a closet. Everything seemed fine. I locked the door, set my bag on the table, and lit a fire in the stove. It took a while to get going, but soon enough, the place felt warmer. I ate a quick dinner from a can, washed it down with water, and decided to step outside for a bit before it got too dark. The woods were quiet, the kind of silence that pressed in on you. No wind, no rustling, just the sound of my own footsteps on wet leaves. I walked around the cabin, checking the shed. The door was still locked. I peeked through the small window, seeing nothing but some tools and an old generator. I circled back toward the front and stopped. There were footprints in the mud. Not mine. They were fresh, leading from the trees to the porch, stopping just at the steps. I felt a chill creep up my spine. I hadn't seen another car, hadn't heard anyone. The place was too far off the main road for someone to just wander here by accident. I looked around, shining my flashlight into the woods, but there was nothing, just trees stretching out in every direction. I took a slow step back, feeling my heartbeat in my throat. The footprints were deep, heavier than mine, and the pattern was strange, almost like whoever left them had been dragging one foot. I turned back toward the door, keeping my flashlight pointed at the trees. I didn't like this. I had a rifle in my truck, but I hadn't loaded it. That felt like a mistake now. I went inside and locked the door. The fire crackled in the stove, but the cabin suddenly felt colder. I took the rifle out of my bag, loaded it, and kept it next to me on the couch. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe an old hunter, maybe just my nerves acting up. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. I sat there listening. The wind had picked up outside, brushing branches against the walls. I could hear the rain starting again, a light tapping against the metal roof. I stared at the door at the single window by the table. The footprints had stopped at the porch. That meant someone had been standing there, looking in. I stayed awake for hours, my ears straining for any sound. The fire burned low, casting long shadows on the walls. Then I heard it, a creak, not from inside, from the porch. I froze, gripping the rifle. The sound was slow, deliberate, like someone shifting their weight on the old wooden boards. I didn't move. The sound came again, closer to the door. Whoever it was, they were still out there. I stood up slowly, careful not to make noise. My boots felt heavy against the floor. I moved toward the window, keeping to the side, and lifted the curtain just enough to peek out. I saw nothing, just the dark trees, rain dripping from the branches, the empty clearing. But the footprints were gone. The mud was still wet, still fresh, but the footprints had disappeared, like they had never been there at all. A wave of unease settled in my chest. I wasn't imagining this. I knew what I saw. Someone had been here and now they were gone. I backed away from the window, checking the lock on the door again. It was solid. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the rifle close, sitting near the fire until the sun finally started to rise. The rain had stopped, leaving everything soaked and heavy. I stepped outside as soon as it was light enough to see. The mud was still there, but the footprints hadn't returned. But something else had. Near the trees, just at the edge of the clearing, a single boot print, deep, facing the cabin. Someone had stood there, watching. I packed my things and left. I never went back. A week later, Mark called me again. He thanked me for checking on the cabin. I told him everything was fine. I didn't tell him about the footprints, or the feeling that, even now, someone was still out there, watching. I didn't have much choice when I took the job. It was the kind of work that didn't pay well, but I needed whatever I could get. The job was simple: keep watch over an old graveyard and maintain the small cabin next to it. It wasn't supposed to be hard. The graveyard wasn't large. It sat on a stretch of land just outside a small town. A dirt road led to it, barely wide enough for a car. It had no streetlights, and once the sun was down, the only light came from the moon or the old lanterns I set up near the cabin. The graves were old, some dating back more than 100 years. The headstones were worn, names barely readable, some leaning at odd angles. The cabin was even older. It had been built a long time ago, used by the graveyard caretaker back when people actually visited this place. Now, no one really came here. I was just there to make sure no one vandalized the graves or messed around after dark. It rained often. The ground stayed damp, and the air always smelled like wet leaves and dirt. The trees around the graveyard were thick, and when the wind blew, it sounded like whispers moving through the branches. I had worked there for a few months before things started happening. First, it was small things. I'd leave the cabin at night to do a walk around the graves, and when I came back, the door would be slightly open. I thought maybe I hadn't closed it right, but it kept happening. I started locking it, but even then, sometimes I'd come back and find it open just an inch, like someone had been inside but didn't want to be noticed. Then I started hearing noises at night. Not the wind, not animals, something else. It was always past midnight when I heard it. Slow, steady footsteps in the grass. They were close, too close, but every time I stepped outside, there was nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone. Just the graveyard stretching out in front of me, silent and empty. One night, I was inside the cabin, sitting at the small wooden table, when I heard something different. A scraping sound like metal against wood. It came from outside, near the tool shed behind the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. The shed door was slightly open, moving just a little in the wind. I hadn't left it open. I shined my light inside. Nothing. The tools were still on their hooks, the wheelbarrow in the corner, a bag of soil leaning against the wall. Everything looked the same, but then I saw the shovel. It wasn't where I left it. It had been placed in the center of the shed, standing upright, the handle resting against the wall. I knew for sure I hadn't left it like that. I backed out and closed the shed door, making sure to latch it this time. After that night, I started keeping the cabin door locked whenever I was inside. I barely slept. Even during the day, I felt uneasy. The quietness of the place wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt wrong, like something was waiting for me to let my guard down. One evening, just as the sun was going down, I walked through the graveyard like I always did. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for that time of year. The headstones cast long shadows in the fading light. I was making my way back to the cabin when I noticed something at the far end of the graveyard. A grave had been dug up. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The dirt was piled to the side, the wooden coffin beneath it exposed, but the lid was gone. I walked closer, my boots sinking into the soft ground. The grave was deep, deeper than a freshly dug one should be. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. That's when I saw the shovel. It was standing upright in the dirt, just like it had been in the shed. I turned and walked back to the cabin, trying to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. I locked the door behind me and sat at the table, staring at the lantern. I didn't leave the cabin again that night. The next morning, I went back to the grave. The dirt was back in place. The hole was filled. It looked as if nothing had happened. I quit that day. I packed my things and left, not bothering to clean up or lock anything. I didn't care. I never went back. But sometimes at night I still hear it. Footsteps in the grass. A slow, steady sound, coming closer. It was late autumn when my mom and I decided to spend a few days at a small cabin deep in the woods. She had rented it for a short getaway, a chance to escape the noise of the city and spend some time surrounded by nature. The place wasn't too far from town, just about an hour's drive, but it was isolated enough that we wouldn't see anyone else unless we went looking for them. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, built decades ago by someone who must have loved the woods. It sat on a clearing surrounded by thick trees, the kind that stretched high and blocked out most of the sunlight even during the day. There was a narrow dirt road leading up to it, the kind that looked like it hadn't been used much in years. The grass on either side was overgrown, creeping onto the path in some places, making it clear that whoever owned the land didn't bother maintaining it. By the time we arrived, the sky was already turning gray. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. The wind rustled through the trees, making the branches sway. It wasn't too cold yet, but I could tell that the temperature would drop once night fell. We unloaded our bags from the car and stepped inside. The cabin was small, just one main room with a kitchenette in the corner, a fireplace, and a separate bedroom at the back. The furniture was old but well kept. The wooden floors creaked under our steps, and the air inside had that faint, musty scent of a place that had been closed up for too long. There were a few windows, but they were small, and even with the lights on, the place felt dim. The first night was uneventful. We ate dinner, sat by the fireplace, and listened to the wind outside. It was peaceful in a way, even with the occasional creaking of the old wooden beams. By the time we turned in for the night, the woods outside were silent, the only sounds coming from the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. That evening, as the sun set, a thick fog rolled in from the woods. It moved fast, creeping through the trees and settling low to the ground like a heavy blanket. By the time darkness had fully set in, the fog had surrounded the cabin, making it impossible to see anything beyond a few feet from the windows. I didn't think much of it at first. Fog was normal in the woods, especially with the season changing. But something about it felt different, too thick, too sudden. It swallowed the trees, muting the sounds of the forest, and made everything outside feel distant and unnatural. Mom and I went about our night as usual. We ate, played a few card games by the fire, and talked about nothing in particular. But there was this lingering unease in the air, like something was watching us from the trees. The feeling didn't go away, even as we laughed and tried to shake it off. At some point, I went to the window to check outside. The fog had only gotten worse. The trees were nothing but dark shapes in the distance, their outlines blurred by the thick mist. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw something move. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the way the fog shifted in the wind. But no, something was there, standing at the edge of the trees. It was just a dark figure, barely visible through the mist, but it was there. I stared for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't move. It just stood there, motionless, facing the cabin. I stepped back from the window and turned away, my heart pounding. I didn't say anything to Mom. Maybe I didn't want to worry her, or maybe I just didn't trust my own eyes. Either way, I tried to ignore it. But that night, sleep didn't come easily. The cabin was silent except for the occasional creak of the wood settling. The wind outside had died down, leaving only the sound of my own breathing in the dark room. I turned over, trying to get comfortable, but no matter how much I shifted, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it. A noise, faint but unmistakable. A slow, deliberate sound, like footsteps on the porch. I held my breath and listened. The footsteps were light, barely more than a whisper against the wooden planks, but they were there. They stopped just outside the front door. I didn't move. I just lay there, heart hammering in my chest, waiting. Then, a soft creak as if something leaned against the door. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to convince myself that I was imagining it. But then came another sound, a faint rustling, like someone running their hand over the old wood. And then, nothing. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. I don't know how long I stayed like that, frozen in place, ears straining for any sign of movement. But eventually, sleep must have taken over because the next thing I knew, it was morning. When I got up, Mom was already in the kitchen, making coffee. She didn't mention anything unusual, and I didn't bring it up. Maybe she hadn't heard it. Maybe I really had imagined it. But when I stepped outside to get some fresh air, I saw them. Footprints. Clear, distinct footprints in the damp dirt, leading from the trees to the front porch. I stared at them for a long moment, my stomach twisting into knots. They were fresh. The shape of them looked normal enough, human even, but something about them felt wrong. The way they came so close to the door, how they stopped there and didn't turn back. I didn't say anything to Mom. I just stepped back inside, locked the door, and tried to push it out of my mind. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. We went for a walk, tried to enjoy the quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The woods felt different now. The trees no longer looked peaceful. They looked like they were hiding something. That night, the fog returned, thicker this time, heavier, pressed up against the windows, blocking out the world beyond. And once again, just before I turned away from the window, I saw it, the figure, closer now, still standing, still watching. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there waiting, listening. The footsteps came again, slow and careful. Then, a light tap on the window, just once, soft, almost testing. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then, the footsteps retreated, vanishing into the fog. By morning, the footprints were there again, leading from the trees, stopping at the window. That was the last night we stayed. I didn't say anything to Mom. I just told her I wasn't feeling well, that we should head home early. She didn't argue. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. The fog had started to lift, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something standing at the tree line, watching, waiting. We never spoke about that trip again. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about those footsteps, about the way they stopped just outside the door. And I wonder if, somewhere out there, in those silent woods, someone is still watching, waiting. It was early October when I drove up to my uncle's old hunting cabin in northern Montana. The last time I had been there was years ago, back when I was a teenager tagging along with my father and his brother during deer season. My uncle had passed away a few months back, and my father had asked me if I wanted to take a trip up there and clean the place out before winter set in. He wasn't in the best shape to be making the trip himself, so I agreed. The drive up was long and quiet, cutting through miles of dense forest with only the occasional gas station or rundown bait shop to break up the scenery. It had been raining on and off all day, the kind of cold autumn drizzle that soaks everything and leaves the air feeling damp and heavy. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the trees, casting long shadows across the dirt road. The place looked almost exactly the same as I remembered, small, sturdy, built from dark wood that had faded over the years. The windows were dusty, and the porch sagged a little more than it used to, but the structure itself seemed solid enough. The surrounding forest was thick, pressing in on all sides. I stepped out of the truck and stretched, the air smelling like wet leaves and pine. Unlocking the door was a struggle. The key stuck in the old rusted lock, and I had to shove my shoulder against the wood to get it open. Inside, the air was stale and cold. Dust covered every surface, and there was a faint smell of old wood, dampness, and something else. Something I couldn't quite place. I set my bags down and took a quick look around. The main room had a table, a couple of chairs, a fireplace with a stack of wood beside it. A small kitchen sat off to the side, the cabinets still filled with old canned goods. There were 2 bedrooms in the back, each with a single bed and a small window looking out into the woods. I spent the next couple of hours cleaning, sweeping dust off the floors, airing out the rooms, and checking to make sure everything was in working order. The old generator still ran, though it sputtered when I started it. The fireplace worked fine, so I got a fire going to chase out the damp chill in the air. By the time I finished, it was completely dark outside. The rain had picked up again, a steady tapping against the roof. I made a quick dinner, ate in silence, and decided to head to bed early. I was exhausted from the long drive, and there wasn't much else to do. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The fire had burned down to a soft glow, casting flickering shadows across the room. The rain was still coming down steady, a rhythmic sound against the roof. Then I heard it, something outside, a soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps on wet leaves. I lay completely still, my heartbeat picking up. Could have been an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon nosing around. But the sound was too steady, too purposeful. Someone was walking outside the cabin. I slowly sat up, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow, moving around the side of the cabin. My truck was parked out front, the only vehicle for miles. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here. I reached for the flashlight I had left on the nightstand. The beam cut through the darkness as I pointed it at the window. The glass was dirty, and the outside was too dark to see much, just the faint outline of trees shifting in the wind. Then the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, waiting. The silence stretched on for too long. I got up, careful to move quietly, and grabbed the old hunting rifle my uncle used to keep above the fireplace. The weight of it was reassuring in my hands. I made my way to the front door and pressed my ear against it. Nothing, just rain and wind. After a few minutes, I unlocked the door and stepped outside onto the porch. The flashlight beam swept across the clearing in front of the cabin. Trees, wet grass, my truck. Nothing out of place. Then I saw them. Footprints. Fresh, deep footprints in the wet earth, leading from the woods to the cabin. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier. I turned the flashlight toward the side of the cabin, where I had heard the footsteps earlier. The footprints continued around the edge of the building. Whoever it was had been circling the cabin. A slow, deliberate circle. I swallowed hard, my grip tightening on the rifle. The nearest town was a good hour's drive away, and I hadn't seen another person since I left the highway. No one should be out here. I stepped back inside and locked the door, double-checking the windows. Then I sat in the chair by the fireplace, rifle across my lap, and waited. The rest of the night passed in silence. By morning, the rain had stopped. The forest was quiet, the sky a dull gray. I stepped outside again, following the footprints. They led around the cabin, past the back door, and disappeared into the trees. Whoever had been out there hadn't left in a hurry. I didn't waste time packing. I threw my bags into the truck and started the engine, the sound breaking the morning stillness. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin sat there, unchanged. The footprints were still visible in the wet ground. And just at the edge of the trees, where the footprints disappeared, I thought I saw something move. Something standing just inside the tree line, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove straight back to town and never went back to that cabin again. I had met Sam at the gym a few months back. We weren't best friends, but we worked out at the same time, spotted each other on occasion, and made small talk in between sets. He was the type of guy who kept to himself, but I could tell he was disciplined. We weren't close, but we had that gym bond. Not quite friendship, but enough to say yes when he invited me to his family's cabin for a weekend trip. I didn't ask too many questions about it. He mentioned it was deep in the woods, a few hours out of the city, and had no cell service, but it was a good place to clear your mind. It was late September, and the air was already cooling down. I figured it'd be a nice change from the usual routine: work, gym, eat, sleep, repeat. We left early on a Friday, packed light, just the essentials. I brought a duffel with clothes, a flashlight, a knife, and some protein bars. He packed even less. The drive started normal, long stretches of road cutting through open fields, the occasional farmhouse in the distance. But as we got deeper into the woods, the roads narrowed. Asphalt turned to gravel. The trees grew thicker, swallowing the sunlight. Felt like we had left the world behind. It was sometime past noon when we arrived. The cabin wasn't much, just a small wooden structure, probably built decades ago.
No fancy amenities.
No electricity, no running water. There was an old wood stove, a pile of chopped firewood, and a single lantern hanging by the door. It looked like no one had been there in a long time. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No cars, no buzzing electricity, just wind moving through the trees and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere in the distance. I helped Sam unload the truck, carrying bags inside while he checked around the place. The floorboards creaked under my weight. Dust hung in the air, smelled like wood, old books, and damp earth. There were 2 small beds against the wall, a table with mismatched chairs, and shelves stacked with canned food and supplies. "We'll chop some wood before it gets dark," Sam said, tossing me an axe. I caught it, nodded, and followed him outside. I don't know why, but something about the place unsettled me. It wasn't fear, not yet, but a feeling, the kind that lingers in the back of your mind, whispering that something isn't right. We worked in silence, chopping logs, stacking them neatly. The sun was getting lower. The trees cast long shadows across the ground. By the time we finished, the sky had darkened. That was when I first noticed it. A sound, faint, almost too distant to hear, like footsteps on dry leaves, somewhere deeper in the woods. I glanced at Sam, but he didn't react. He just kept stacking wood, his back turned to me. I listened for a moment, then shook it off. Probably an animal. Inside, we lit the lantern and ate a quick meal. Canned beans, some bread. The cabin creaked as it settled. I could hear the wind outside, rustling the trees. At some point, Sam pulled a knife from his bag and set it on the table. Just a simple hunting knife, but the sight of it made me uneasy. "Bears," he said, as if that explained it. I nodded but didn't say anything. Night settled in, and with it, the quiet deepened. I hadn't realized how much I relied on background noise. The hum of a fridge, cars outside, the distant chatter of people. Out here, there was none of that, just silence. I lay in bed, staring at the wooden ceiling. The lantern flickered. Shadows danced along the walls. Every creak, every gust of wind, every shift in the air felt louder. Then I heard it again. The same sound. Footsteps. Closer this time. I turned my head slowly, listening. It wasn't just the wind. It was movement. Deliberate. Slow. Like someone was outside, just beyond the cabin walls. I shifted, my body tense, listening. Then it stopped. The silence returned. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks. A branch falling, an animal wandering close. That was all. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I fell asleep. The next morning, Sam was already up, outside, chopping more wood. I stepped out, stretching, the cold air hitting my skin. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked. He shook his head. "Just the wind." I let it go. Maybe I really had imagined it. We spent the day hiking, exploring the area. The deeper we went into the woods, the less it felt like a weekend trip and more like something else. There was no sign of other people. No old campsites, no trails, nothing. Just trees stretching in every direction. At some point, we found an old, rusted trap half buried in the dirt. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. I nudged it with my boot but didn't touch it. That evening, we sat outside by the fire. The sky was dark, no city lights to drown out the stars. The flames crackled, sending embers into the air. That was when I saw it. A figure, far off between the trees, standing, watching. I didn't move, didn't speak. Sam must have noticed my reaction because he turned his head slightly, following my gaze. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. A shadow swallowed by the woods. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Sam stood up, walked to the edge of the firelight. Nothing, just darkness. I wanted to leave. Every part of me was screaming to get in the truck and go. But I didn't. Instead, we went inside, locked the door. I barely slept. Every sound made my heart pound. Somewhere, in the middle of the night, I heard it again. Footsteps, not from outside, from inside. A slow, dragging sound against the floor. I lay there, frozen, barely breathing. The sound stopped. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Then, in the dim lantern light, I saw it. Sam's knife no longer on the table. It was on the floor, right beside my bed. I didn't sleep after that. At dawn, I got up, grabbed my bag, and told Sam we needed to leave. He didn't argue. The drive back felt longer. The road stretched endlessly. Neither of us spoke. I never went back, never asked Sam about it. We still saw each other at the gym for a while, nodding in passing. Then one day he was just gone. I never saw him again. I never found out what happened in that cabin. And I never want to. It was the middle of November when I took a night shift at a remote cabin deep in the woods. The job was simple, at least that's what I had been told. My boss had bought an old hunting cabin and was in the process of renovating it. He needed someone to watch over the place at night, make sure no animals or squatters got in, and keep an eye on the expensive tools and materials stored inside. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I welcomed it. I had done security work before, and the idea of spending a few nights in a quiet, empty forest didn't bother me. I was given a key, a flashlight, and a walkie-talkie that connected back to the main office nearly 20 miles away. The job would last for about a week, just until the main locks and security cameras were installed. The first night was uneventful. The cabin was old, but it had a sturdy frame. The interior was a mess. Half of it gutted, planks and tools scattered around. There was no electricity, only a few battery-powered lanterns that cast long, flickering shadows across the walls. The wind outside was constant, making the trees groan. At one point, I thought I heard something moving in the brush, but when I shined my flashlight through the cracked windows, there was nothing but blackness beyond the tree line. By the second night, I started noticing small things that put me on edge. The door to the back storage room, which I was certain I had shut, was slightly ajar when I did my rounds. Some of the tools, which I had seen in one position earlier, seemed to have been moved. It could have been my imagination, or maybe I was just tired. The cold made my body ache, and the wooden floors creaked under my boots every time I walked across them. The third night, the rain started. Not just a drizzle, but a full-on downpour that hammered against the cabin like waves against rock. The wind picked up, rattling the loose planks, making the whole place feel alive. I kept to my routine, checking each room, making sure everything was as it should be. I didn't expect anything to happen, but a part of me felt uneasy, like I was being watched. Around midnight, I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind throwing branches against the cabin. But then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching against the soaked ground. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the front window. The beam of light cut through the rain, but I saw nothing, just trees and darkness. I told myself it was nothing, probably an animal. But then I heard it again, closer this time, just beyond the porch. I moved to the front door, heart pounding, gripping the flashlight tight. I listened. The rain masked a lot of the noise, but beneath it, I could hear breathing. Heavy, controlled breathing. I stood there for what felt like hours, barely even moving, waiting to hear it again. But the sound was gone. Only the wind and rain remained. I checked the front porch, but it was empty. The muddy ground was too soaked to hold footprints. I locked the door behind me and forced myself to sit down, telling myself I was being paranoid. The fourth night was worse. The rain hadn't stopped, and the wind was stronger than ever. The inside of the cabin felt even colder than outside. I kept every lantern lit, but the shadows still felt like they were creeping in from the corners. I did my rounds, checking each room, making sure the doors and windows were locked. When I reached the back storage room, my breath caught in my throat. The door was open, not slightly ajar this time, fully open. The darkness inside swallowed my flashlight's beam. I knew I had locked that door. I stepped inside slowly, scanning the room. Tools were scattered across the floor, and the air smelled damp, like rotting wood. There was no sign of anyone inside, but the window at the back of the room was open. Rain had blown in, soaking the wooden floor. I shut and locked the window, then backed out of the room, shutting the door behind me. My hands were shaking. Someone had been inside. I sat in the main room with my flashlight in one hand and my pocket knife in the other. I thought about calling my boss, but what would I even say? That I heard noises and found a door open? That wasn't proof of anything. I decided to stay awake for the rest of the night. Every sound outside made me jump. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps outside, moving around the cabin. Slow, careful, circling. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Whoever was out there was waiting for something. The footsteps stopped near the back of the cabin. I waited, barely breathing. Then, a sound made my blood turn to ice. The back door handle rattled. Whoever was outside was trying to get in. I stood up slowly, heart hammering against my ribs. The handle rattled again, harder this time. I gripped my flashlight and took a step forward, my boots creaking on the old floorboards. The sound stopped. For the next hour, I sat in the chair, gripping my flashlight like a weapon, waiting. The rain continued to pound against the roof. I didn't hear anything else after that. No more footsteps, no more rattling. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I forced myself to go outside. The rain had let up slightly, and the muddy ground was covered in tracks. Footprints, not animal tracks, human footprints. They circled the entire cabin, stopping at each door, each window. I packed up my things and left that morning, driving straight to my boss's office. I quit on the spot. I didn't care about the money. Whoever had been out there that night wasn't lost. They weren't some hiker looking for shelter. They had been watching me, waiting, and if I had opened that door, I don't think I would have made it out alive. I don't know what made me take the job. I guess it was the money. A friend of a friend knew a guy who needed someone to check on an old hunting cabin deep in the woods. Nothing complicated, just a few days of cleaning, making sure the roof hadn't caved in, checking for leaks, keeping the generator running. The guy who owned it lived out of state and couldn't make it up that season. It was the kind of work no one really wanted to do. Too remote, too much hassle. But I needed cash, and I figured a few nights alone in a cabin wasn't the worst way to make it. I took the job without asking too many questions. The drive out there was long, 2 hours on paved roads, another hour on dirt. The deeper I got into the woods, the more I felt it. That quiet, empty feeling. The kind that settles in places no one visits anymore. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, the sky turning to that pale orange that meant I had maybe an hour of daylight left. It was a simple structure, with siding, tin roof, a small porch out front. It had been built years ago, maybe in the 60s, and looked exactly like you'd expect. Weathered, worn down, but solid. I parked my truck, grabbed my bag, and went up the steps. The key was where I had been told it would be, tucked beneath a loose plank on the porch. I let myself in. The air inside was thick, stale, heavy, like the place had been shut up for too long. The furniture was basic, a table, a few chairs, a cot in the corner. A small kitchen with an old gas stove. There was no running water, just a hand pump outside. The generator was in a shed out back. I set my bag down and walked through the cabin, checking each room. Everything seemed fine. Dusty, but nothing broken. No signs of animals getting in. But there was a smell. It wasn't strong at first. Just a faint, sour scent, like something had gone bad in the walls. I figured maybe a rat had died somewhere. It wasn't unusual in places like this. I clean up a bit, air the place out, and it'd be fine. I got the generator running and set up my sleeping bag on the cot. I didn't need much. Just a few nights of work, and then I'd be out of there. The first night, I barely slept. Not because I was scared, just because the place felt wrong. The air was too still. The trees outside blocked the wind, and the cabin was deep enough in the woods that no sounds carried. No cars, no voices, no distant hum of power lines. Just silence, and the smell. By morning, it was worse, stronger. I checked the kitchen first. Nothing in the cabinets, no spoiled food. I checked under the cot, behind the stove. Still nothing. I went outside and walked the perimeter of the cabin. Maybe something had crawled under the porch and died. But there was nothing. By the second night, the smell had seeped into everything. It clung to my clothes, got into my nose, made it hard to breathe. I started to feel sick. Like whatever was causing it was getting into me. I tried to ignore it. I wasn't the kind of person to get spooked easily. I'd spent time in places like this before. Isolated, empty. But there was something about this smell that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just rot. It was worse. By the third day, I knew I had to find it. I tore through the cabin, checking every inch. I moved furniture, pried up loose boards, even checked inside the old stove. Nothing. And yet it was there, thick in the air. I was standing in the center of the room when I noticed something. A draft, faint but there, coming from the floor. There was a trapdoor. I had seen it before but hadn't thought much about it. Just figured it led to a small root cellar. But now, standing over it, I felt something shift in my gut. The smell was strongest here. I knelt down, grabbed the edge of the wooden hatch and pulled. The second I opened it, the air changed. The smell hit me so hard I nearly fell back. Thick, choking. My eyes watered. My stomach twisted. I coughed, gagged, forced myself to breathe through my mouth. There was a ladder leading down. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it inside. The space below wasn't a root cellar. It was bigger, deeper. The walls were lined with old, rotting wood, the dirt floor uneven and damp. There was something on the ground, a pile of rags, maybe. I climbed down, one step at a time, my boots sinking into the soft earth. The smell was unbearable. I stepped closer. It wasn't rags. It was a body, or what was left of one. The skin was dark, stretched tight over bone. The clothes were old, ripped jeans, a flannel shirt. The face was barely there, just hollow sockets where the eyes should have been, the mouth frozen open. It had been here for a long time. I backed up, my chest tight, my legs shaking. I had to get out. I climbed the ladder so fast I nearly slipped. My hands were shaking as I shoved the hatch closed. I stood there, my mind racing. Who was he? How long had he been here? I grabbed my bag and went outside. I didn't care about the job anymore. I didn't care about the money. I just needed to leave. But as I stood by my truck, I realized something. The body hadn't just been thrown down there. Someone had put it there, and someone had sealed the hatch. I looked around. The trees, the silent woods stretching in every direction. I wasn't alone. I got in my truck and started the engine. I didn't waste time looking back. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never told anyone about what I found. Not directly, just an anonymous call to the local sheriff's office. I don't know what happened after that. I never went back to check. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I still smell it, that thick, rotting scent, and I wonder if whoever put that body down there ever came back. It was never my plan to spend the night in that cabin. I had no reason to be there, no reason to even know about it. But sometimes life doesn't go the way you expect. And that night, I found myself trapped in a place I never should have been, with a man I should have never met. It started with the road. It was supposed to be a shortcut, one that would save me at least an hour on my drive home. I had been on the highway for most of the day, and I was tired of staring at the endless stretch of asphalt. The map on my phone showed a smaller road that cut through the forest, winding its way through the mountains before reconnecting with the main highway on the other side. It looked safe enough, just a simple back road. I had been driving for about 30 minutes when I realized I hadn't seen another car in a while. The road was getting narrower, the trees pressing in on both sides. My headlights cut through the darkness, but beyond that, there was nothing. No streetlights, no signs, just an endless stretch of black trees and gravel road. I tried to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. It was just a road after all. Then the rain started, came suddenly, hammering against my windshield in thick sheets. The wipers struggled to keep up, and soon I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I slowed down, gripping the steering wheel tightly as I navigated the twisting road. The gravel beneath my tires felt loose, and I could feel the car sliding slightly with every turn. Then I saw something ahead, something large and dark in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding over the wet gravel. My heart pounded as I squinted through the rain. Fallen tree. It stretched across the entire road, blocking any chance of moving forward. I sighed, rubbing my face with my hands. I was exhausted, and now I had no choice but to turn around. I shifted the car into reverse, but as I looked in the rearview mirror, my stomach dropped. The road was gone, or at least it looked that way. The rain had turned the dirt into mud, and my tires had already sunk deep into it. I pressed the gas pedal, but the car didn't move. I tried again, harder this time, but all I heard was the sound of my tires spinning uselessly in place. I was stuck. I sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel as the rain continued to pour. There was no cell service out here. I had already checked a dozen times. I had no choice. I had to get out and find help. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment, pulled my jacket tighter around myself, and stepped out into the storm. The rain soaked through my clothes instantly, and the wind cut through the trees like a blade. I shivered, wiping water from my face as I looked around. That's when I saw the cabin. It was hidden in the trees, barely visible through the rain. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then a flash of lightning lit up the sky, and I saw it clearly. An old wooden structure, small and weathered, standing alone in the woods. I didn't want to go near it. Every instinct in my body told me to stay away. But what choice did I have? I was miles from the nearest town, stuck in the middle of nowhere with no cell service and no way to get my car free. I needed help, and the cabin was my only option. I forced my feet to move. As I got closer, I could see that the cabin was old, really old. The wood was dark and rotting in places, the windows covered in grime. There was no sign of life, no light coming from inside. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the handle. I knocked. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time. The sound echoed through the trees, swallowed by the storm. Still no answer. I tried the handle. The door creaked open. Inside, the cabin was dark. My flashlight cast long shadows across the wooden floor, revealing a small, simple room. There was a table, a chair, and a fireplace filled with cold ashes. A single bed sat against the far wall. The blanket rumpled as if someone had been sleeping there recently. But no one was here. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The air smelled damp, mixed with something else, something I couldn't quite place. The rain beat against the roof, drowning out any other sound. Then I saw the knife. It was sitting on the table, long and sharp, the blade gleaming in the light of my flashlight. My stomach twisted as I took a step closer. The knife wasn't clean. There was something on it, something dark, dried along the edge. Blood. I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. I needed to get out of here. I turned toward the door, and then I heard it. A noise outside. Footsteps. Someone was coming. My breath caught in my throat. I turned off my flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the trees. I moved quickly, pressing myself against the wall near the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. The footsteps grew closer, slow, deliberate. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. They knew they had time. Then the door creaked open. A shadow filled the doorway, tall and unmoving. I couldn't see his face, but I could hear his breathing, slow and steady, like he was listening. I didn't move. Then he stepped inside. I saw the outline of him in the dim light, the way he carried himself. He was big, broad-shouldered, moving with the ease of someone who belonged here. His boots were heavy against the floor, each step sending chills down my spine. And then he stopped, right next to the table, right next to the knife. He picked it up. My blood ran cold. I could barely breathe. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, a desperate, frantic drum. Then he turned. The next few moments happened in a blur. I bolted. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I ran straight for the door, shoving past him with all the strength I had. He let out a grunt of surprise, but I didn't stop to see if he was following. I hit the ground running, sprinting into the trees as fast as my legs would carry me. The rain blinded me, my feet slipping in the mud, but I didn't stop. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps pounding against the wet earth. He was fast, too fast. I pushed myself harder. Then I saw the road. My car was just ahead, still sunk in the mud, but I didn't care. I ran straight for it, throwing myself against the door and yanking it open. I scrambled inside, slamming the lock down as I reached for the keys. The engine roared to life. I didn't think. I didn't check to see if he was still there. I just slammed my foot on the gas. The tires spun. The car didn't move. I screamed in frustration, slamming my foot down harder. The engine whined, the wheels skidding uselessly in the mud. Then, suddenly, the car lurched forward. I don't know if it was luck, or panic, or sheer force of will, but somehow, the tires found traction, and I shot forward. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just drove, and I didn't stop until I saw the lights of the highway again. I never reported what happened. I never told anyone. I don't know who that man was, or what he had planned for me, but I do know one thing. That road wasn't on my map anymore. And that cabin? I never found it again. It was late October when I drove out to my uncle's old hunting cabin. He hadn't used it in years, and after he passed, it was left to me. I'd only been there a few times as a kid, but I remembered it being deep in the woods, far from anything. My uncle had been a quiet man who didn't like being around people, so the cabin was built somewhere that no one would bother him. The drive from town took nearly 3 hours, most of it on dirt roads that hadn't been maintained in years. The forest was thick, the trees growing so close together that they blocked out most of the afternoon light. It had been raining earlier that day, and the roads were still slick. My tires slid in the mud a few times, making me nervous. Out here, if you got stuck, you were stuck. There was no cell service, no passing cars, and no one to help. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. The place looked smaller than I remembered. The logs were dark with age, the roof sagged in places, and the front porch was covered in a thick layer of leaves. I parked my truck near the tree line, grabbed my bag, and made my way to the door. The air smelled like damp wood and earth. The wind was still, and the only sounds were my boots crunching on the wet ground and the distant caws of crows. I unlocked the door with the old key my uncle had left me, pushing it open with some effort. The inside smelled musty, like dust and old wood. A fireplace sat against one wall, with a stack of firewood beside it. There was a small kitchen, a table, and a single bed in the corner. Everything was simple, just as I had remembered it. I set my bag down and went to check the windows. The glass was dirty, but the locks were still solid. The back door led out to a small porch overlooking the trees. Beyond that, nothing but thick forest for miles. I spent the next hour unpacking, sweeping out the worst of the dust, and setting up a fire. The warmth helped drive out the damp chill that clung to the cabin. I sat at the table, eating a quick meal from the supplies I'd brought, and listened to the silence outside. There were no distant highways, no hum of civilization. Just the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of trees in the breeze. Then I heard something, a soft, distant call. At first, I thought it was a coyote, but the sound was strange. It was high-pitched, almost like a person calling out. But it wasn't quite right. It sounded off, like someone imitating a human voice but not getting it right. I put my fork down and listened. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the leaves outside, but the sound came again, closer this time. It was coming from the trees. I stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The trees swayed, their branches creaking. I couldn't see anything, just blackness between the trunks. But then, for a split second, I thought I saw movement, a shape just beyond the tree line. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and shined it toward the woods. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks and undergrowth. But there was nothing there, just trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I locked the door and sat back down by the fire. Maybe it had been a coyote or a deer. The woods were full of animals. But that sound, it hadn't been an animal. It had sounded like a person. I told myself I was overthinking it, that I was just spooking myself out. It was an old cabin in the woods. Of course, it was going to feel eerie. I banked the fire, climbed into bed, and pulled the blankets around me. The wind had died down again, and the forest was silent. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it again, closer. That same high-pitched call, but now it sounded like it was right outside the cabin. I held my breath, my heart pounding. Then something scraped against the front door. A long, slow drag, like nails or claws raking against the wood. I sat up, reaching for my flashlight. The sound came again, this time at the window. A soft tapping, like fingertips against the glass. I didn't move. I just sat there, listening. The tapping stopped. Silence. Then, a sound that made my blood run cold. My own voice, right outside the window, calling my name. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My mind was screaming at me to do something, anything, but I was frozen. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the dark window, waiting for whatever was out there to move again. But it didn't. Eventually, the fire died down, and the cabin was plunged into darkness. I stayed awake until dawn. When the first light filtered through the trees, I finally worked up the nerve to step outside. The air was cold, the ground damp with dew. I checked around the cabin, looking for tracks, but the wet leaves had obscured everything. But the door, the wood was scratched, deep gouges running down its length. And beneath the window, faint but unmistakable in the mud, were bare footprints. They were human-shaped but wrong. Too long, too narrow. I didn't stay to find out more. I grabbed my things, threw them in the truck, and got the hell out of there. I don't know what I saw. I don't know what I heard. But I do know one thing. Something was out there, and it wasn't human. I didn't plan to stay in France for long. It was meant to be a short trip, a week at most. A break from work, a change of scenery, time away from the routine I had built for myself over the years. I wasn't the kind of person who took vacations often. I liked structure, the familiarity of my own home, the predictability of my neighborhood. But something about this trip felt necessary, like I had to pull myself away from the comfort of my usual life, if only for a little while. I found a cabin to rent in a small rural area a few hours outside of Lyon. It was cheap, isolated, and surrounded by thick woods. Perfect for what I was looking for. Quiet, solitude. A place where I could sit in the stillness and let my mind wander. The drive there was uneventful. Long stretches of road lined with trees, small villages that seemed half empty, the occasional road sign in French that I barely understood. I followed the directions I had saved on my phone and eventually turned onto a narrow dirt road, the kind that made you feel like you were going the wrong way even when you weren't. The cabin was smaller than I expected but well kept. Wooden walls, a slanted roof, a small porch out front. Inside, there was a single bedroom, a kitchen with outdated appliances, and a living area with a fireplace that smelled like it had been used recently. The owner had left a note on the table, welcoming me and mentioning that cell service might be spotty. That didn't bother me. I had prepared for that. The first couple of nights passed without incident. I spent my time reading, walking through the woods, and enjoying the stillness of being away from the noise of the city. At night, the cabin felt different, the kind of silence that made your ears ring, like the world had stopped moving outside. I wasn't scared, but I was aware of how alone I was. It was on the third night that I saw her. It had been raining all day, a steady drizzle that made the air thick and damp. I had spent most of the evening inside, listening to the rain hit the roof, watching the trees sway through the window. It was late, past midnight, I think, when I decided to step outside for some fresh air. The rain had stopped, but everything was still wet, the ground soft under my boots. I didn't see her at first. I stepped off the porch, walking a few feet into the open space in front of the cabin. The air smelled like wet wood and earth. I stood there for a while, listening to the distant sound of dripping water, staring up at the dark sky. And then, as I turned to head back inside, I saw movement near the tree line. She was standing there, half hidden by the trees, just beyond the reach of the cabin's weak porch light. At first, I thought it was a trick of my eyes, a shadow moving in the breeze. But as I squinted, I could make out the shape of a woman. She was facing me, her body still, her head tilted slightly to one side. I didn't move. Something about the way she stood there, unmoving, watching, sent a cold wave through my body. I wasn't sure what to do. Call out? Pretend I hadn't seen her? Go inside and lock the door? I took a step back. She didn't move. The distance between us was too far for me to make out her face, but I could see that she was wearing something long, a dress or a coat that clung to her body in the damp air. Her hair was dark, hanging loose around her shoulders. I took another step back and then another. Still, she didn't move. The only sound was the dripping of water from the trees, the soft squelch of my boots on the wet ground. I felt my breath coming faster, my hands damp with sweat. And then, without warning, she turned and walked away, not back into the woods, but along the edge of the trees parallel to the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps, like she wasn't in a hurry, like she wanted me to see where she was going. I didn't follow her. I went inside, locked the door, and stood by the window, watching until she disappeared into the darkness. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside made my skin crawl. The wind, the rustling of leaves, the occasional creak of the wooden walls. I kept expecting to see her again, standing outside the window, closer this time, watching. But she never came back. Not that night. The next morning, I told myself it had been nothing. Maybe a local passing through. Maybe someone from a nearby house, curious about the stranger staying in the cabin. I wanted to believe that, but as I stepped outside, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Footprints, deep imprints in the wet ground, leading from the tree line to the side of the cabin. Not stopping at the front, not lingering near the porch, but circling the cabin over and over, the tracks overlapping, weaving around the building like she had spent hours walking in the same path. I stared at them, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I had to leave. I went inside, packed my things as fast as I could, and got in my car. The road was muddy, the tires slipping as I drove, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop, didn't look back. When I reached the nearest town, I found a small cafe with Wi-Fi and booked a hotel for the rest of my stay. I never went back to the cabin. A week later, when I was home, I looked up the area out of curiosity. It took some digging, but I eventually found something. A woman had gone missing near that area years ago. She had been living alone in a small house deep in the woods, not far from where I had stayed. They never found her. Only the remains of her belongings, scattered in the trees. I don't know if it was her, I don't know if I saw something real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But I do know one thing. When I saw her that night, standing in the trees, watching me, she wasn't lost. She knew exactly where she was. And worse, she knew exactly where I was too.